So my name is Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension, and I'm in Lynn and Benton counties, work with the Master Gardeners. And I have been organizing this webinar series as an advanced training for our Master Gardeners for the last couple of years. And so just a couple housekeeping notes, and then I'll introduce our special speaker today. So if you've attended one of these webinars before, this is the same spiel that you're going to get. If you have questions for our speaker, so there'll be time at the end where we'll go through and be able to answer at least some of your questions. If you could please enter those into the Q&A box, that gives us a chance to keep track of questions, know when they've been answered, and please don't put those in the chat box, because what happens is it just keeps scrolling and then we lose your question. So feel free to use the chat box to chat with each other, but if you do have a question for our speaker, please put that in the Q&A box. We are recording this, and so it'll be available within a couple of days, and you'll get an email that lets you know when the recording is available. You also get a short survey to let us know how we're doing with all of this. So let's see, I got my paper as usual with my little bio here. So today we have one of our special sessions where we invite one of our OSU students to come and share what their research is. So it's a little bit different than some of our typical webinars. So it's going to be really focused. And so I'm really pleased to have Matthew Bucy with us today. And Matthew is an undergraduate research assistant with the OSU Pollinator Health Program. So he is currently in the Honors College at OSU, and he's studying environmental sciences with a focus in geographic information science. So he's been with the OSU Pollinator Program for the past 2 years, and as part of his being in the honors program, he has to do an honors thesis, and so this is sharing some of the results from his thesis. And so what he was looking at was whether labels of high-risk insecticides were communicating the product toxicity to bees in accordance with EPA guidelines, Environmental Protection Agency guidelines. He's had chances to present his work and recently won an award at the 2018 joint annual meeting of the Entomology Societies of America, Canada, and British Columbia last November. So that's congratulations to Matthew. In the Q&A portion, we're going to have Dr. Andony Melathopoulos will join in to answer any questions that maybe fall more under the Pollinator Health Program. So he might be chiming in at the end there. So at this point, Matthew has his presentation up, and we will let him go ahead and get started. We are going to have some polls this time. We haven't had polls in a couple of the last webinars. That will give you a chance to answer some questions, and so there'll be a screen that'll pop up, and we'll walk you through all of that. All right, so I will let Matthew go ahead, and I'm going to mute. All right.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Brooke. My name is Matthew. I am an undergraduate research assistant at Pollinator Health Extension. So I did recently complete an honors thesis that looked at how insecticide labels were communicating product toxicity to bees and whether that followed EPA recommendations. I'll touch on the results of that thesis that are most important to you all as master gardeners towards the end of the presentation, but the bulk of this presentation will be walking you through how to read a pesticide label to understand a product's hazards to bees and what you can do to minimize those hazards. And so let's get started. So as master gardeners, you may be reading labels and applying products yourselves, or community members may have questions for you about pesticides and bees and how they should go about picking a product that would minimize the potential harms to bees. And so it can be a pretty confusing process, especially where you're in like a huge pesticide aisle. One, to just figure out where on a label you're supposed to look for all that information, and then to figure out what that information is even telling you. And so as a quick, to use the first poll to illustrate how it can be confusing, right here I have 2 fictional products with the front of their labels displayed, and that's the only information you have access to. So there's this product on the left, product A, in the red label, insect killer is the product name. The label claims it can kill more than 240 garden insects. It's fast acting and deadly. And then here we have this product on the right, product B. Its label's green. It's safe natural garden protection is its name. The label says it can control aphids and other listed insects. Based off of just this information, which of these products do you think is more toxic to bees? Product A here on the left, the red labeled product, product B on the right, the green labeled product, or C, both products are equally toxic to bees. So let me know what you think.
All right, let me launch that poll for you. All right, so you should see a small box that pops up. Yep, I see folks are already voting. So we'll give it, I don't know, about 10 more seconds. Looks like folks are chiming in. And all right, it looks like it's kind of slowed down there. So I'm going to end that poll. There'll be a couple more in here, so you'll get the hang of this. And then we will share the results. Does that show up for you, Matthew? Are you able to see that?
Yeah, it does. And it looks like 95% of people, oh, got it right. So good job, everyone. So the correct answer is C, both of these products are equally toxic to bees. And the point I was trying to get at with this is, especially with garden products, you can't just judge the label based on its aesthetics, whatever like natural terms it uses or its product claims. And so here, if you look at the bottom of both of these labels, you'll notice that both products use the same active ingredient and they have the same percentage of that active ingredient. So based on this information, they do appear equally toxic to bees. That was just the quick don't judge a label by its cover. And so now I'll get into the good stuff about how you can actually read a label. But before I do that, I do want to introduce key label terms and sections that I'll be bringing up throughout the presentation. I'll go through pretty quickly, but I'll talk about each of these things in more detail later. I just wanted you to be familiar with the terms. I also just wanted to say that any like trade names that are mentioned or images of like real world labels that are seen, that's just for illustration. That's not an endorsement or a criticism of the product. So here, I'm just showing the front page of the label. And so this product label is like your best window into figuring out what the toxicity of the product is to bees. Here I show the front pack of the label, which is just the front page. And so up towards the top, you'll see there's information about the company that makes the product, the specific product name. This one, it's a complete fruit tree spray, and then concentrate, its formulation. So that is a helpful piece of information to have when you're looking at a product. I want to zoom in specifically on this information that'll also be found on that front page of the label. So these are the ingredient statements. So the label will state its active ingredients and other ingredients. So the active ingredient is the chemical that's actually killing the pest. Some products will only have one active ingredient. For garden products, it's not uncommon for there to be 2, 3, or 4 in this case. The label will also state what % of that product is other ingredients. So those are chemicals that aren't believed to be killing the pest. They just improve product performance, like maybe they help extend the shelf life of the product or something like that. Their labels are not required to actually list what the other ingredients are because it's proprietary. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a label that actually lists that, but you'll get the list of the active ingredients. I also want to point out this thing you'll see on labels, the EPA reg no, the EPA registration number. And so you'll see that on the label, and you'll always see this product name up on the front page of the label. And I just wanted to point out that how a brief overview of how this whole like label approval process goes is that a company will develop a master label that EPA approves once it like meets all the necessary requirements. But that one master label is what states adapt. States can add, can require additions to the label, but they can't like subtract from those requirements. But that one master label that EPA approves can get sold under a bunch of different product names. So if you're looking at 2 product labels and they have the same EPA registration number, but different product names, they're registered as one master label, like the critical toxicity information you see on that label, or on both of those labels should be the same. I also want to introduce the most important label section we'll be talking about. So pesticide labels are divided into different sections. There will be a section called the environmental hazards. There's a lot of interesting information in there, but pertinent to this presentation is that if there's any statement about a product's toxicity to bees, you should find it in this environmental hazard section. Actually, in this example I show, if you see down here this bee caution, this product is highly toxic to bees, we'll go more in depth about how to interpret this information. So if there's any mention of bee toxicity on a product's label, you should see it in this environmental hazard section. I also just wanted to introduce the use directions, so they'll be under that heading, directions for use. These are like specific instructions on how to best apply the product. Labels aren't required to put bee toxicity information in these sections, but you may see them there. They're also just good sections to read because they'll tell you how you should apply this product, and you are required to read the label and follow its instructions regardless. I'll be differentiating between general and specific use directions. General use directions, as shown here, are towards the beginning. Those are like instructions that apply to every potential application of the product. Specific use directions are for like specific plants that you would apply the product on. So the example here is our specific use directions for roses, ornamental evergreens, and flowers. Some labels are more detailed with this section than others. I just wanted to differentiate what I mean between general and specific use directions. So that that was a really quick introduction to that, but I just want to do a quick recap. So the active ingredient, that's the chemical that's actually killing the pest. One EPA registration number, so one like EPA registered label can be sold under many different product names. You see two labels with the same EPA registration number, that the key information on those labels should be the same. The environmental hazard section is where you're going to find those bee hazard statements if they are present on the label. And then general and specific use directions give you instructions on how to best apply that product. Some labels will have information about bees in those sections, some won't. Labels are very long and there's a lot more that goes into them. If you're curious or more curious about this topic, you can check the EPA label review manual. So now I'll begin the good stuff, going through how to actually read a label to understand the product's toxicity to bees and what you should do when applying that product. I do want to note, so my thesis looked at if all labels follow EPA recommendations, and as a spoiler alert for the second half of the presentation, not all labels do. So it is possible you'll encounter a label that doesn't follow EPA recommendations, and those labels are really difficult to interpret. This process is really for those labels that are following those recommendations. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll give you some resources you can consult if you encounter a label that doesn't follow EPA recommendations. But I just wanted to have that clarification here. So before I get to the meat of the presentation, Brooke, I was just curious if there are any questions about anything I've said so far.
There's one question from Nancy, and she says you might want to answer this later, or you might be getting to that later. But she wants to know, are the products required to put correct or known environmental hazard information on the label?
Yes, so products are required to express environmental hazards, and then so they are required to express them. EPA has recommended language that labels should be using so that labels are consistent, and so we can easily educate people. Like, you see the label says this is what you should do. So they are required to express them if those environmental hazards are there. It's the actual language that they use. That is what EPA recommends. Okay.
Yep, I would just go ahead and we'll collect some more questions and have time to answer them.
Okay, so on to the good stuff. Unfortunately, there is more than one step in the process to read a label to protect bees. But the first step, and the most important one, is to read that label's environmental hazards section. If there's any information about bees on the label or product toxicity to bees, they should be in the environmental hazards section. As a preview of what you can gain from reading that section, the information in the environmental hazards will let you know how safe it is or whether you should apply that product around bloom. So if it's safe to apply around bloom during the day, if a nighttime application at bloom is okay, or if it's a product that you shouldn't be applying at bloom at all. After reading the environmental hazards, you will want to read those directions for use, the general directions and the specific directions for whatever application you're considering. There might not be information about bees there, but there still might be, so you should read them. Finally, and this only applies to certain neonicotinoid products, there is a label section on those products called protection of pollinators. If the label of the product you want to apply has that section, you should read that as well. And so now I'm going to start by talking about how you can interpret the information in the environmental hazards and going more into what information you can find there. So the environmental hazards, if there's any information about product toxicity to bees, will state two things. It'll state firstly the acute toxicity of the product to bees, and that's like the toxicity resulting from like one direct instance of applying that product. How toxic is the product to bees on contact? That kind of and I'll go more into what like language you'll see that expresses this information. But that acute toxicity statement is what you can use to determine whether or not this is a product you should be applying around bloom. There will also be information about the residual toxicity of the product to bees. So it's not just enough to know how toxic is one application of the product. You want to know how long it's going to take the residues of that product to become what we consider non-toxic for bees. And so that residual toxicity information is what you'll use to see if the product's maybe safe to apply at night around bloom, or if it's just something that should be avoided around bloom altogether. So I'll start by talking about this acute toxicity statement that you'll see in the environmental hazards. So this toxicity is based on the product's active ingredient, not the actual formulated end product with the inactive and active ingredients. The test for acute toxicity is just done on the technical grade active ingredient, and the results from the test are used to divide active ingredients into three toxicity groups or toxicity categories. So a category 1 active ingredient is the most toxic to bees. Category 2 is still toxic, but slightly less so. Category 3 active ingredients are considered not toxic to bees. And so how those groupings are actually translated into label statements. If you see a statement in the environmental hazards that says this product is highly toxic to bees, that's a category, that product contains a category 1 active ingredient. The statement is toxic to bees, so just this product is toxic to bees, is category 2. The EPA label review manual still says that label should be saying moderately toxic to bees. I've read hundreds of labels and I've never seen the word moderately used in that setting. For an actual applicator, the difference between category 1 and 2 doesn't matter as much to you. I just wanted to give you some background on why you'll see highly toxic to bees or just is toxic to bees. Because if you see either of those, that means that you should not be applying that product at bloom during the day. Ideally, it's a product you should just try and avoid applying at bloom, but it is definitely too acutely toxic to apply during the day during bloom. So if you don't see any statement, so if the environmental hazards doesn't say this product's highly toxic to bees, or it doesn't say this product is moderately toxic to bees, if there's just no statement of bee toxicity, that either means that that product uses a category 3 active ingredient, so the chemical that's killing the pests isn't considered toxic to bees, or for whatever reason EPA deemed maybe there's not a risk of exposure to bees. Basically, if you don't see an acute toxicity statement, there's no special actions required, or at least no special bee-related actions required on your part. And I also wanted to mention I will have some of the poll questions or example environmental hazard sections to walk through just to really drive this point home. I now want to talk about the residual toxicity statement you'll see in the environmental hazards. And so acute toxicity information lets you know, okay, I definitely shouldn't apply this at bloom during the day. But the residual toxicity information will tell you if maybe a nighttime application of that product is still safe around bloom. So once we know that a product has an active ingredient that's acutely toxic to bees, we do this test for residual toxicity. And so based on this test, and this test is actually done on the final product, so active and inactive ingredients mixed together. Based on this test, products are grouped, determined to have either extended residual toxicity or not extended residual toxicity. I'll just call it residual toxicity. So extended residual toxicity means the residues of that product remain toxic to bees for longer than 8 hours, whereas a not extended residual toxicity means the residues of that product take less than 8 hours to become non-toxic to bees. What this means for you as people who will be applying pesticides potentially is that a product with extended residual toxicity should not be applied during bloom at all. It's going to take longer than 1 night for those residues to become non-toxic to bees. It's a product you shouldn't be applying at bloom, period. However, so even if that environmental hazards has an acute toxicity statement, if the residual toxicity of the product is under 8 hours, you can actually apply that product during bloom at night. And so you won't see the actual time printed on the labels. What you'll see is these keywords. So if you see a statement, do not apply this product while bees are foraging, or do not apply this product while bees are visiting, that means the product has extended residual toxicity. You shouldn't apply that product at bloom, day or night. However, if you see a statement, do not apply this product if bees are actively foraging, or do not apply this product while bees are actively visiting, that actively keyword lets you know that the residual toxicity of this product is under 8 hours, so a nighttime application of this product at bloom is okay. Again, if you don't see any statement, then there's no action required. This is can be pretty confusing. It took me a while to get the hang of it. So I have a few poll questions that are example environmental hazards sections that I made up. And so we can go through and test everyone's comprehension. So here is the first environmental hazards, the first label. Here's its environmental hazards section. I checked. This is the only place on the label that has information about toxicity to bees. And so I'll read these statements to you. So for this product, its environmental hazard section says, this product is highly toxic to bees exposed to direct treatment or residues on blooming crops or weeds. Do not apply this product or allow it to drift to blooming crops if bees are actively foraging on the treatment area. So the keywords we see here, this is a highly toxic product that you can apply while bees are actively foraging. So the first question I have for you is, can you apply this product at bloom during the day?
All right, folks, so I launched that poll. So you should see a box pop up and we'll give you a few more seconds. Looks like a lot of votes are coming in. Couple seconds for folks to find the little box. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end that and share those results.
Okay, let's see. It looks like 99% of people got it right. Great job, everyone.
Nice.
Yeah, so that you see that highly toxic keyword, even if it said just is toxic, if you see highly toxic or is toxic to bees, don't apply that product at bloom during the day. So we're going to keep the same environmental hazards section up. So again, highly toxic, don't apply while bees are actively foraging. Can you apply this product at bloom at night?
Making sure I had the right question up there. All right, so so you should have a little Q&A box or a polling box pop up, and it looks like we're getting folks. This one's a little bit more split here. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share those results.
Oh, we are pretty split. Okay.
Yeah.
So it looks like 50% of people said that yes, you can apply this product at bloom at night. And that's correct because of it says you can apply while bees are actively foraging. So if you see actively foraging or actively visiting, that actively lets you know the residual toxicity is less than 8 hours. You can apply that product at night, even during bloom. Had it just said are foraging, so had there been no actively, then you can apply it at night. On to the next question. Here's a new label. And so this environmental hazard section says, this product is toxic to bees. Do not apply this product or allow it to drift to blooming crops if bees are visiting on the treatment area. So we know we can't apply this product at bloom during the day because it says is toxic, but can we apply this product at bloom at night? Can we apply, if the product says it can't be applied when bees are visiting, can we apply it at bloom at night?
All right, so that poll is open. Sounds like maybe just a couple of folks are having trouble finding that poll box. Sometimes it gets hidden behind the active window of Zoom, but Matthew's going to be reading off the questions too. So, all right, give it a few more seconds. People are deliberating. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. And sharing results there for you.
Okay, so it looks like 53% of people said no, you cannot apply this product at bloom at night, and that's correct. So there's no actively in the environmental hazards. It just says don't apply while bees are visiting. That means no nighttime application at bloom is allowed. You can't apply that product at bloom at all. And so before I move on to the talking about the directions for use section, that environmental hazard stuff is like the most critical part to understand. So I just wanted to check with Brooke if we have any questions so far.
There's a couple, and you might pass if you're going to answer them later. Let's see. So Mark wants to know about how do you know if the bees are actively foraging in that area? And is this, how is that based? And it might be based on bee biology.
Yeah, so the way that you should be reading those statements is don't worry about deciding if the bees that you're seeing are actively or not actively foraging. Just see if it says that you can't apply while bees are actively foraging. Just know that that means that if you have to apply that product around bloom, applying at night is okay. If it says don't apply while bees are foraging, that means don't apply at bloom, period. The language is pretty opaque, but you don't actually have to determine how active the bees you're seeing are. Just actively means nighttime application, okay. Not actively, no application around bloom.
Great. Some of the other questions seem like there may be bigger questions, and so maybe we'll hold those till the end Q&A section.
Okay, great. So I will now move on to talking about reading the directions for use section. And so many labels won't repeat any information about bee toxicity here. They're just required to put that info in the environmental hazards. But I just wanted to make you aware that you can find information about bee toxicity in these sections on some labels. Usually it's just that acute and residual toxicity information repeated from the environmental hazards. That's the information you're going to get from pesticide labels. So here on the label on the right, you'll see in the directions for use, they repeat that residual toxicity statement. So don't apply this product while bees are actively visiting. That means that if you have to apply the product around bloom, you can apply it at night. And then this label on the left, though, actually does provide some additional information. So it repeats that labels. These are two labels from two different products. This label on the left does repeat the residual toxicity statement, but it goes more in depth into about don't apply if plants are flowering, wait till petal fall. This was an example of a label that gives even more information. If you'll notice on this label on the left, this depiction of a honeybee and a red diamond, I want to draw attention to that because that's a nice segue into the next section you may have to read. So that bee diamond or bee hazard icon indicates that that product is a neonicotinoid. And so now I'll go into that protection of pollinators section I mentioned. So some products that contain certain neonicotinoid active ingredients are required to have this extra protection of pollinators section on their label. I believe it's been required since 2013. Here I just have a list of the 7 neonicotinoid active ingredients. It's not worth memorizing that list. I just wanted to point out that Firstly, if you see on the whatever label you're looking at, the claim that it's a group 4A insecticide, active ingredients are put into different groups by the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. Group 4A means neonicotinoid. I just wanted to point that out. If you see that on a label and aren't sure what it means, different groupings will have different numbers. 4A is what they assigned for neonicotinoids. And that protection of pollinators label section is only required on 4 of the neonicotinoid active ingredients. And so it's possible you may never see a label that has this section. I just want to make you aware of its existence. This is from an EPA document. This is like an example of what this label section will look like. It's very easy to spot because it has a huge title and there is this very large depiction of a honeybee, the bee hazard icon. Not only does that help you find this protection of pollinators section, but if the way most of those neonicotinoid labels are designed is outside of the environmental hazards, if any like bee information is mentioned in the directions for use, it'll be accompanied by that icon. So it's like an easy way to skim the label and find out where all the bee information is. Just look for that icon. Of course, this only pertains to the neonicotinoid products that are required to have this label section. Just an overview of what you'll find in this section. It begins by talking about that there are these special extra restrictions that exist for the product because it's a neonicotinoid. It then talks more about how bees can become exposed to the product and then gives some specific actions you should take if you use this product. If the label has this section, it's super easy to find. I just kind of wanted to make you aware of what that section kind of looks like. I also wanted to point this out. This is really only pertinent to the Oregonians listening in, but I mentioned that states can have additional requirements beyond just what the EPA requires for labels. And so for Oregon, there actually is an extra statement required on those same 4 neonicotinoid active ingredients. If a product contains any of those ingredients, there will be a statement telling you can't apply that product to linden trees and other Tilia species. If anyone remembers a bumblebee kill in 2013 in Wilsonville, that was like one of the things that that precipitated this extra rule. It'll be mentioned on the label, so don't worry about like having to remember that. And this is an Oregon specific rule, so you'll find it on Oregon labels. I just wanted to make you aware that that extra thing exists and to illustrate that states can require extra label statements. So now our final poll question. So here is a label. The environmental hazard section says that this product is highly toxic to bees. Do not apply while bees are foraging. Then in a specific use directions section, it says don't apply while bees are actively visiting. So this label says don't apply while bees are foraging and don't apply while bees are actively visiting. This is from the same label. Based on this information, can you apply this product during bloom at night?
All right, let me go ahead and launch that poll. So you should see that window come up. And I see a bunch of votes coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds. Guys are doing a good job. All right, we'll give it 3 more seconds. And we'll go ahead and end that. So let me share those results with you. All right, can you see those okay?
Yeah, okay, so it looks like most people said no, you can't. The answer I would have gone with is that it is unclear. So if you want to act really conservatively, then yeah, you probably shouldn't apply this at bloom at night. But it's unclear based on this label what the actual residual toxicity of the product is. So the environmental hazards would indicate you can apply it at night. The specific use directions indicate that you can. This type of problem is what my thesis looked at. So I looked at the labels of insecticides used in different high-risk situations for Oregon beekeepers, and I looked for problems like this, or if they were using language other than what the EPA recommends, or if they were putting that language in other sections. And so I don't have time to go give a full overview of my thesis, but I just kind of wanted to introduce like what the labels I'll be talking about what those actually look like. So when I started reading insecticide labels for an entirely different project, I noticed that some weren't following these EPA recommendations. And so I made a thesis out of that observation and found that, yeah, not all of these labels are going to follow EPA recommendations. I ended up looking at 232 labels. Most of these were commercial product labels, but I did look at garden product labels that are available to the general Oregonian. And almost a third of those labels had, at least in some way, they were deviating from the EPA recommendations. So what I've been telling you, you should find on a label. Why this matters to you as a master gardener is out of when I broke these results into the commercial labels and the garden labels, about 26% of commercial product labels deviated from EPA recommendations, while almost 44% of garden labels deviated from EPA recommendations. So sorry, master gardeners, but this is a more pronounced problem for the garden product labels. And so I'll just go over like some of these, what exactly some of these deviations look like, so some things you might see. Then I'll point out some resources that you can turn to if you find a label that doesn't follow EPA recommendations. The most common problem I saw was the acute toxicity statement not actually aligning with the toxicity data of the active ingredient. And so if you'll remember way back when I talked about this acute toxicity statement, I mentioned that those active ingredients are broken up into three categories: the highly toxic, moderately toxic, and not toxic. And so I mentioned that the label statement should reflect those acute toxicity categories. So like an active ingredient that's highly toxic should have the statement, this product is highly toxic to bees. And what I found was I found 41 product labels, all of which had highly toxic active ingredients. And those labels either just lacked any acute toxicity statement whatsoever, or they used that is toxic to bees. And most of these were garden products. And so our interpretation of that was that bee hazard information is required for a toxic product that has a risk of becoming exposed to bees. So because of the specific uses or maybe something about the formulation, the product was considered to not have that risk. So that label language might not have actually made it to the final label. So as an applicator, that might not be a huge deal if you're just trying to figure out what you should do when applying that product. But if you're using the label to actually like learn about the toxicity of the product, the impact of this is that labels can have ingredients that are highly toxic to bees, but the label can not mention anything about bee toxicity. The second most common issue I saw was just acute or residual toxicity information still being expressed as is required, but they weren't using those EPA recommended terms that I've been repeating over and over. So I'd see labels that said like, don't apply while bees may forage, or they would just say, there's a potential residual toxicity to bees for this product. There might be potential residual toxicity, but as an applicator, since I don't have any, that language isn't tied to like an EPA recommendation, I can't figure out what that information means to me. Can I apply that product at night? Is it something I should avoid at bloom altogether? I'm not sure. And so the impact of finding a label like this is that it's unclear what the acute or residual toxicity of that product is. It leaves it pretty open to interpretation. Other issues I saw that were slightly less common, but I just wanted to point out, one was inconsistent communication within a label. So that was this example I showed you a while ago where like the environmental hazards would say one thing, the use directions would say another. I did see that on a few labels. Most of those inconsistencies occur within that label's one environmental hazard section. There's just two statements that don't exactly line up. So at least it'll be easy to catch when you're reading the label. And that was mainly a problem for communicating that residual toxicity information. Other deviations from EPA recommendations that I saw, information being out of place. I did see that on a few labels. So like those acute and residual toxicity statements should be in the environmental hazards. I did find labels where they were outside of the environmental hazards. Wasn't a very common problem, but is something I saw. And then the issue of incomplete communications, like a label would have an acute toxicity statement and then there'd be no information about residual toxicity, which doesn't give you the full picture of the product's actual toxicity. That was the least common thing I saw, but I did see it. The exact nature of these were just to provide some like context into my thesis. I just wanted to let you know that there will be labels that don't follow that EPA recommended language, and so it's very hard to interpret what you should be doing when you're applying that product. Now, as I start getting towards the end of my presentation, I do want to illustrate some things you can do. This isn't like a vetted process to find, like, to exactly decipher what those confusing product labels mean. There's some extra resources you can turn to about pesticides that can maybe give you a better idea of the product's toxicity. So one, like the best piece of advice I can give is just to think ahead and be conservative. So as shown in this Oregon Bee Project graphic, avoid planting pest-prone plants. Try not to spray pesticides during bloom in general. Try and minimize pesticide drift. Just take those like precautionary measures. And then also regarding this don't spray during bloom, if you're unsure of the product's toxicity to bees, if the label's confusing, it is best to just try and not apply that product during bloom because that's like the highest risk period for bees. There's also an app where you can get information about the toxicity of different active ingredients to bees. It's the How to Reduce Bee Poisoning from Pesticides app developed by OSU. Find it on iTunes by searching How to Reduce Bee Poisoning or searching Bee Safety in Google Play. There you can search any active ingredient you're considering applying and get information about its toxicity to bees. There's also a publication version of this for those who like more traditional reading material. Also, National Pesticide Information Center has a lot of good pesticide databases and like fact sheets. They take calls from 8 to noon during weekdays. I put their website up here. They're also a really valuable pesticide resource. I do want to mention that the Oregon Bee Project has these handouts that kind of summarize this presentation that can be made available upon request to any like master gardener tabling event or whatever. You can give these to members of the public and it'll walk them through how they can read those pesticide labels to understand product toxicity to bees. Before I move to questions, I just had one final thing I want to note. So there are some active ingredients that are considered so low risk that their label development and registration is a little different. Those are like products that the active ingredients, like an essential oil, those labels are going to can look totally different. They don't have an EPA registration number. They may not even have an environmental hazard section. So if you're getting a product that has like an essential oil as an active ingredient, I can't be much help in telling you how to read those labels because it can be, I'm less sure about what those labels will actually look like. Well, thank you everyone for your time. I hope I made this process of reading a pesticide label to protect bees a little more clear. And so now I can take questions and Andony will also be here to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. You can't hear us all clapping, but we really appreciate you sharing your time with us. I know you're in your last couple weeks of the semester and you're graduating. So if anybody wants to, get Matthew a job, it's pretty amazing. So while folks are putting in questions, and if you have questions, please use the Q&A box. That'll just lets us keep track of them. Put on your calendar for June 28th is our next Master Gardener webinar. We're going to have Joshua Vlach from the Oregon Department of Agriculture. He's going to be sharing about invasive insects, invasive invertebrates that are coming in. So look for that. I know this is a pretty hot topic of bees, and so if we do not get to your question, what happens is the webinar software will provide the panelists, so provide Matthew and Andony a printout of your question and your email, and so they'll take a look. If it wasn't a question that was answered by the presentation, then they may be following up with you on that. So, okay. So let's pull up a couple questions. And again, Matthew, if this is outside of your area of expertise, feel free to pass and we will answer this directly offline. So,
okay.
Yep. So Charles had a question early on about the updating of labels. And I know that there's always new science Are either of you aware of like a timeline or how often labels do get updated?
I know they'll have to be updated if they change like the specific uses that are listed on the label. Like if they want to add like a crop you can apply the product on, then the companies will submit a label to be looked at again. Regarding like if there's a mandatory like every 10 or 15 years, this label has to be looked at again. I'm not sure if there is like a mandatory review timeline. I'm not sure if Andony has anything to add there.
Yeah. Hi. In fact, there is under the take these out of my ear. EPA does re-review pesticides periodically, and for example, a lot of the neonicotinoids right now are being reviewed because their time has come up for being re-reviewed. I can't remember what the timeline under legislation is. It may be 10 or 20 years, but every product does get re-registered because the science changes, as Matthew said.
Let's see. So Lori just has a comment more that, you know, recommending night applications can be tricky because bumblebees, right, they're foraging till 9 p.m. or later, right, in the summer months. And so it can be tricky for a home gardener to know when that timing is right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Nancy has a question about residual toxicity and how that was tested. And there's another question in here about have any of these products been tested on the larva? And so I know that you touched on residual toxicity. Can you just do a quick review of what that looks like in the label and the testing?
Yeah, so the residual toxicity is a measure of how long it's going to take for those residues to be not toxic to bees. And so the general gist of the test is like they'll apply the product on a sample plant, I'm not sure what it is, and they'll measure how long it takes until it only kills like a certain amount of test organisms. And so that ends up just being, regardless of that ends up being translated as extended residual toxicity or not extended residual toxicity. And actually this made me realize something I forgot to mention. I mentioned that I saw that problem of acute toxicity language not aligning with data. I wasn't able to get a residual toxicity data set for my thesis. And so that might also be a problem for residual toxicity language, but it wasn't something that I looked at. Then I don't know if Andony has anything he wanted to add.
Yeah, just a quick thing is that they don't test them on flowers, but rather they test it on leaf material. So the test involves everybody who registers a pesticide has to do this. They will spray it on typically alfalfa leaf, and then they will harvest the alfalfa and put the bees on it at various intervals and out to, I think, 5 days. And so that gives them a real good idea of like how quickly the product would degrade if a bee were to contact the surface of that leaf.
And so that's not related at all to larvae, like bringing any pesticides back to the hives. It's just those adult bees.
Right. And the same goes for acute toxicity. That corresponding test is just contact toxicity to adult honeybees.
Okay. Larry has a question about the toxicity category.
Mm-hmm.
He would like to know if it is provided on the label itself, or is there another place that you would need to go to find that information?
So the active ingredient acute toxicity category will not be printed on the label. It's just translated into those statements I mentioned, the highly toxic or moderately toxic. However, that this app I mentioned and the corresponding publication, you can search by active ingredient, and that will tell you the acute toxicity category of that active ingredient.
Great, and we did have a couple requests in the Q&A for to share the apps that you mentioned and the contacts. And so what we'll do when once the recording is ready, you'll all get an email, and so I'll pull that information from the presentation. But I did have a couple of folks who are master gardeners. So Sherry's interested in that one-page summary that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe there's a way that you could share that, and then I can pass that along to the master gardeners if that's readily available. I think this is the one.
And that's I think that's something that Andony might want to comment on as well. But yeah, these Oregon Bee Project handouts can be made available upon request. Just contact Andony or Pollinator Health Extension, and he'll hook you up.
Okay.
Yeah, for master gardeners across the state who want to get this out into the public, we have a number of these. Go to info@oregonbeeproject.org. So Brooke will circulate that. You let us know the quantity that you need, and we'll make sure that you have them to stock at the plant clinics.
Okay, and is it also something that's printable, possibly, that if folks want to just print locally, that's an option too?
I think Andony can answer that. If whether or not you can just print those files locally, if that is easier. Okay, he says you can. So yeah, you should be able to download that from the website and can print it as you need.
Great. So everyone, I will collect all of these so that you have them in one place and get those out to you. All right, so you got a couple options here for jobs. So Mark Lesher says you should definitely be applying to the EPA. And so you might want to follow up with that.
Thank you.
Nice. Loretta has a question about seed packets that may have been treated with insecticides. And this is a little bit outside of, I think, your realm of what you studied. So feel free to pass. But sometimes folks will buy treated seed that they're planting. So she's curious if they need to have that chemical listed or any other information on that seed packet.
Yeah, those seed packet requirements are not something I'm familiar with. So unless Andony is more familiar with that, I can't be much help there.
Okay,
Sorry.
and we can always answer that offline too. Yeah.
No, but the answer is that the seed treatments are different. The actual application has been done by the person who puts it on the seed. And so that isn't covered. You won't see a label on it. But just to be mindful that inoculants can also look like a seed covering, but they're actually a beneficial bacteria. So just because there's a coating on a seed doesn't mean it's an insecticide.
Great. Let's see. So I'm just kind of looking through these questions. A lot of them we're going to get information to folks. And some of them I think are a little bit off or more like comments and things. So I think at this point, we're going to wrap this up. Again, if your specific question wasn't answered, we'll get a list of your emails and we'll go through that and be in touch with you directly. But there's a lot of thank yous coming through. And so thank you again, Matthew, for sharing your research, and the very best of luck to you in your future endeavors. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in June.
Thanks so much.